Hello, everyone. We are pleased to present our European Islamophobia Report 2024. And this is our 10th year. This year we mark our 10th year. And today we have some of our authors and also a keynote speaker with us. I would like to welcome you all and thank you all for your time and your contribution. We have Ahmad Shaheed. He's the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief, and he will be delivering a keynote speech today. And we have Farid Hafez from the Bridge Initiative, Georgetown University. Farid has been co-editing the report with me from the beginning, and also he has been authoring the Austrian report. And also we have Tahir Abbas with us today from the Aston University. Tahir joined us this year, and he has authored Netherlands report. And we have also Cora Døving from the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies. She has authored the Norwegian report. And also, not but least, Amina Smits. She has authored Belgium report this year and also in the previous years. And she is a researcher at Türkiye Research Foundation. So welcome you all. And I would like to start with Ahmad Shaheed. He will be delivering a keynote speech today. And thank you for your time and your contribution. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude for the privilege of speaking at the launch of the European Islamophobia Report 2024. And my thanks to the co-editors, Professors Farid, Hafez, and Professor Enes Bayraklı for inviting me to speak today. It's a real honor to speak today. Before turning to the report, I want to take a moment to express my sympathy and condolences to all those who were affected by the recent terrorist attack in Bondi Beach, Sydney. This attack targeted members of the Jewish community during the beginning of the Hanukkah festivities. Such a heinous attack is pure evil and highlights the vulnerabilities that Jews face around the world. Jews, Muslims, and Christians, and others look forward to their religious festivities and social occasions, not only with enthusiasm that these occasions should be greeted with, but sadly, the degree of apprehension, trepidation, knowing that there is always a danger lurking behind these celebrations due to the unchecked hate that has been unleashed in the world. The Bondi Beach attack on Monday and the numerous other attacks elsewhere in the recent weeks and months underscore the necessity of standing against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of racism and hatred. While we may never completely eradicate evil, we must unite against hate, regardless of where, when, or by whom it occurs. I also want to salute Ahmad al-Ahmad, who exemplifies what upstanders can and must do, a point I will come to later on. Let me turn to the report at hand. I would like to congratulate the two co-editors, the 31 other authors of various national chapters, the proofreader, of course, the publisher, and of course the four co-sponsors of this report for their efforts in compiling and producing this important document. It sheds light on one of the most pressing issues in contemporary Europe, the rampant discrimination against Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim. One of the most significant contributions of this series of annual reports, now in its 10th year, is its exposure of a form of racism that is often denied or ignored or sometimes even promoted. Even where there are attempts to confront the rising tide of anti-Muslim racism, these positive measures are often overwhelmed by escalating bigotry and hate crimes targeting Muslims. Given the under-recognition of this pervasive issue, the first challenge for Muslims and their allies is to gather and present data that highlight their experiences of racism. The evidence collected in this report serves as a tool to move beyond denial and provides a compelling basis for anti-racism activists, advocates, and their allies, including policymakers and duty bearers, to take urgent action. It lays the groundwork for informed engagement on this challenge and serves as a valuable learning tool. For that alone, I applaud the authors of this report. The national assessments provided in the report expose alarming trends. These are detailed with precision and are supported by surveys conducted by various authoritative bodies, such as the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, EUFRA, and national actors like Tell Mama UK, which are recognized for their expertise and credibility. As noted in the report, the EUFRA found that 47% of Muslims reported experiencing discrimination in the past 5 years, up from 39% in 2016. This annual report highlights 5 dominant features and trends related to Islamophobia across Europe. Number 1, anti-Muslim racism is pervasive and expanding across all domains of public life. Number 2, Islamophobia draws on and drives a vicious cycle of this on the securitization of Muslims, at present starkly manifested, as the report notes, in the shadow of the war in Gaza. 3, anti-Muslim racism is institutionally embedded. 4, it is a bigotry that has become normalized and mainstreamed. And 5, it has strong discursive influence and strong gendered impacts. Together, these trends indicate that Islamophobia is not only interpersonal, as often is said, but also institutional, structural, and moreover, sadly, incentivized. Worsening trends have created a toxic spiral that fuels a race to the bottom in demonizing Muslims. We have moved beyond the simple passing of the dinner table test, as it were. It has now become a crucial factor for success in elections and gaining access to political power. The report reveals that anti-Muslim racism is not only a scandal, but also has turned into a European tragedy. The combination of political freedom, economic prosperity, and social cohesion that Europe rightly prides itself on is under threat from unchecked anti-Muslim racism. It's a vital reminder that racism that begins with one community never stays confined to one community. Thus, anti-Muslim racism is not just scandal, it's a tragedy, since it is allowed to thrive not only at the expense of Muslims, but also by sacrificing respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms that everyone cherishes. However, the report serves more than just as a learning tool and a wake-up call. It can also be a very useful advocacy tool. I want to highlight 5 principal recommendations from the report made by the co-authors, what it asks duty bearers, particularly national governments, to do. Number 1, demonstrate commitment to combat anti-Muslim racism by adopting proven best practices outlined in various chapters of the report. 2, respect the human rights of Muslims by auditing counterterrorism frameworks and ensuring that they align with Europe's human rights commitments. 3, safeguard democracy and inclusion, as guaranteed in national constitutions and international treaties. Civil liberties and democratic freedoms must be preserved for everybody. Comply with guidance from European institutions. States must fully implement ECRI's revised policy recommendation number 5 on combating anti-Muslim racism. And 5, build civic capacity. Invest in strengthening society coalitions through funding, capacity building, and structured cooperation. None of these recommendations require states to invent new norms or new standards or offer special treatment to Muslims. They simply ask states to address gaps in application and implementation. Moreover, they urge states to uphold their obligations to respect, protect, and promote human rights for all. These are, in my view, modest demands, the bare minimum that states must and can do to mitigate anti-Muslim racism. From my previous work for the UN and continuing international engagement, ranging from mapping how securitization targets Muslims and other communities, to mobilizing efforts against anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and homophobia, the most glaring common denominator across the landscape is the lack of political will. This failure may impact various forms of hatred differently over time and across locations. However, what is frequently lacking in every case is not the resources or the framework, but rather the will to act by those who have the duty to act to prevent and mitigate these attacks. So how can we, civil society actors, generate the political will among state actors to combat hate, especially anti-Muslim racism? Mounting evidence of state failure to act and its toxic effects, as this report documents, can create cognitive dissonance, highlighting the gap between policymakers' self-image and the reality they have created or have allowed to thrive. So I argue that in addition to serving as a learning and advocacy tool, this report also acts as a mobilizing tool, contributing to generating the necessary political will. Drawing on insights from various chapters in this report, along with international good practice, the following measures stand out as beneficial. Number one, engage, inform, and educate policymakers. The focus should be on socializing state actors to good practice. The report shows that there are lessons to be learned from each country's own national experiences. Number two, invoke, mobilize existing frameworks, particularly multi-stakeholder frameworks. The national reports document various initiatives at local, municipal, national, and interdomestic levels that combine domestic and international efforts, such as the observance of International Day to combat Islamophobia. Three, identify synergies with adjacent policy frameworks. Many reports refer to existing national protections for equal rights. It may also be useful to track how anti-Muslim racism impacts indicators linked to national commitments in economic progress and development, even if these commitments do not directly focus on anti-Muslim racism. For example, the cost to taxpayer from hate crimes itself may be a trigger for preventive action. 4. Empower and build the capacity of good actors. The national reports already identify several good actors, and comparative perspectives from different countries can help build capacity and empower these actors and individuals and organizations. 5. Foster solidarity and allyship. As has often been noted, racism targeting one community does not end with that community. The benefits of allyship extend across communities and provide a basis for common ground and united action. Every act of solidarity speaks volumes and can be highly impactful, as demonstrated in the race riots in UK last year or in Ahmad's actions at Bondi Beach just a few days ago. Over the past 20 years of my work at both national and international levels, I have witnessed compelling evidence highlighting the importance of allyship and solidarity. This principle is a recurring theme in various international initiatives. While the international context is beyond the scope of this report directly, effective practices at these levels can be beneficial for national action. For instance, the 2012 Rabat Plan of Action on Combating Incitement to Violence and Discrimination emphasizes the role of solidarity in countering hate. The 2014 Fez Declaration on the role of religious actors, along with the 2019 UN's Global Strategy Against Hate Speech, both advocate for a whole society approach in combating hate. Additionally, the 2025 Tirana platform calls for a multi-stakeholder allyship. Finally, the Granada Declaration, launched just a few days ago, and is the most recent addition to the toolkit of fighting against hate, outlines 10 core principles for a united stance against Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. The declaration directly addresses the fundamental mechanism of racism, whether it manifests as Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. It posits that the most effective way to combat or mitigate social divisions caused by racism is through allyship and solidarity. This unity of purpose can be established by grounding ourselves in human rights principles, as this report also advocates, affirming the inherent and equal dignity of all members of the human family. The value of allyship and solidarity is already reflected in this report itself, as seen in the diverse backgrounds of all the different authors who contributed to this publication. I also want to emphasize that these multi-stakeholder frameworks are not to downplay the crucial roles of state actors, which of course is paramount. My key message is that the most effective way to generate political will among state actors is to mobilize society actors across all faiths and various levels of governance. The report helpfully identifies in every country a range of actors committed to countering anti-Muslim hatred, highlighting the potential for networking and mobilizing both domestically and transnationally. This mobilization, to quote Tom Pegram, can help orchestrate the desired action from reluctant state actors by engaging willing intermediaries with official mandates. Across the tapestry of national equality bodies and municipal actors, as well as international envoys at the European Commission, the Council of Europe, or the OSCE, there are numerous entities that have the authority and means to prompt national actions against anti-Muslim racism. I urge society actors highlighted in this report to engage with these actors and allies. At the end of the day, all that we are doing is invoking a lesson learned primarily in Europe, but not exclusively so, and echoed the preamble of the UDHR, and that is the invaluable insight that the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world lies in the recognition of the inherent dignity of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. This report highlights where states are failing and when there is promise. It is therefore a valuable resource for learning, empowering, mobilizing, and achieving change. I commend this to everybody who cares about human dignity and equal rights for everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this keynote, Ahmed Shaheed. And thank you very much for your words and praise for our report. And I will start presenting the main findings of this year's report, and then I will give floor to Farid. As I mentioned in the beginning, we have started this project in 2015, and this marks our 10th year anniversary, 2024 report. And it's been a long journey for us. And during these years, we have been closely monitoring the Islamophobia in Europe and its spread and its institutionalization in Europe. And of course, it's a pleasure for us to present the 10th edition of the report. Yet, presenting the 10th edition of the report is not an occasion for celebration, of course. And as a co-editor of this report, together with Farid Hafez, I want to begin with a simple but uncomfortable truth that Islamophobia in Europe is not only persistent, yet, but it is increasingly normalized. And over the past decade, anti-Muslim racism has moved from the margins of political discourse into its very center. What we document in the report is not merely prejudice or isolated hate crimes, but a structural pattern that increasingly shapes policies, institutions, and public debate across Europe. One of the most telling indicators of this normalization is political silence. March 15 is the United Nations International Day to Combat Islamophobia. Yet in 2024, not a single European government or major political party officially marked this day. And also in 2023, there was no European government that marked this day. And this silence, we think, matters. What political leaders choose not to recognize sends a powerful message that anti-Muslim racism either invisible, acceptable, or politically inconvenient. The most decisive context shaping Muslim life in Europe in 2024 has been the war on Gaza. Across Europe, Palestinian lives have been systematically devalued and political dissent has been increasingly criminalized. Support for Palestinian rights has been repeatedly conflated with extremism or terrorism, creating an environment in which Muslims are collectively held responsible for geopolitical events. Data from the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights shows that nearly half of Muslims in the EU experienced racial discrimination in the past 5 years. Employment discrimination has increased dramatically, particularly affecting young Muslim women. Hate crimes are rising while trust in institutions is eroding, revealing the institutional dimension of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is no longer confined to the far right. Across Europe, far-right narratives are entering government policy, from hijab bans to securitized migration laws. So there are many recommendations in the report that our authors has put together, but we think that there are three important, very important policy recommendations that stands out. First, Europe must recognize anti-Muslim racism as a specific form of racism. Second, counter-terrorism legislation must be reviewed due to its disproportionate impact on Muslim communities. And finally, civil society coalitions must be strengthened to defend democratic values. 10 years of this report shows us clearly that Islamophobia does not disappear on its own. It must be named, challenged, and addressed politically. Thank you very much for your time. And I want to now give the floor to Farid, and he will present his report on Austria. The floor is yours, Farid.
All right, thank you, Enes. Thank you, Professor Ahmed Shaheed, also for the keynote, and thanks everybody else for being here. Many of you who have been long participating and have been part of this journey several times in a row or interrupted with small interruptions. So what I will do a little bit is maybe give kind of an overview and maybe talk also a little bit about the history, because, you know, when in 2015 we started with the first report covering that year, one of the things that stood out for the country Austria, which is a very small country, Central European country, but also it's a country with one of the largest and highest percentage of the total Muslim population. We're speaking about 9 to 10% of the total population in Austria having a Muslim background. So that's an estimated similar number like France, for instance. And for me, it's also one of the reasons for why Austria as a state is really at the forefront of institutionalized anti-Muslim racism. So I think we got to bear this in mind when I give like a short overview, and I'll give just a short snapshot of some of the findings of the year of 2024 that we covered. But I want us to bear in mind that 2015 was really a super important year, because that was the year when the new Islam Act was implemented. And that act, which was kind of a renewed legislation based originally on the intention to renew an act from 1912, the Islam Act of 1912, but which turned out totally different. And there were there's a lot to say about it, and many scholars have in the meantime written about it, but there are really two aspects which are very fundamental in reshaping the relationship between state authorities on the one hand and organized Muslim communities on the other hand. First of all, the state, in regards to its relationship to the Muslim authority, so to speak, the Islamic religious community of Austria, Islamische Glaubensgemeinschaft in Österreich, was empowered in receiving the ability to interfere in issues of election processes, of establishment of smaller mosque communities, etc. But also the law empowered not only the state vis-a-vis the Muslim community, but also the official Islamic authority, so to speak, vis-a-vis the vast majority of Muslim organized communities. So, as you know, in a lot of European countries, you have a lot of associations, right? You got a number of people who come together for a specific goal, and they create an association. In Austria, that's usually a very easily done thing. But what the Islam Act of 2015 implied was that Muslims, if they want to organize on the basis of their religion, they have to do this not according to the law of association, but according to the Islam Act of 2015. So in other words, there is only the ability for Muslims to organize in regards to religion under the Islamic authority. So in that sense, the Islam Act of 2015 was an empowerment of the state vis-a-vis the Islamic authority, and on the other hand, an empowerment of the Islamic authority vis-a-vis the vast Muslim majorities, the organized Muslim communities. And we see the ramifications and the effect of that still today. And I'll give a couple of examples here. So to just skip over my report, and as those of you who have been following this project, and you know that you can get all of these reports online and access them there, free of charge. For those of you who are familiar with it, we usually try to understand what has happened from January 1st to December 31st in each and every calendar year in terms of Islamophobia in regards to employment, the internet, politics, the legal system, questions of hate crime statistics, etc. To give an impression of what is like the tendency in that respective year, and also get an understanding of what really has shaped Muslim life dramatically. So I'd like to start with the hate crime statistics, and the most important NGO, which is an Islamophobia watchdog called Dokustelle Islamfeindlichkeit und antimuslimischer Rassismus, documented 1,366 cases in 2024. There is also another important survey that was conducted by the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, which was published in 2024, which highlighted in a more comparative perspective, covering 13 EU member state countries, that in Austria, there were 66% of Muslims who had experienced discrimination within 1 year and 74 within a 5-year average. And this is the highest figure among all 13 EU countries that were covered in that report. And I think that already gives you, some kind of an idea of how high the numbers are. And at the very same time, I have to highlight that, as the Fundamental Rights Agency report said, it's only an average of 10% or less than 10% of the Muslim population who do even report anti-Muslim hate crime to the police authorities and other authorities. So this is not to say that this is an exact number, but it's really, it might be even higher than that. And still, Austria is one of the highest in all those 13 covered countries. Also, in regards to anti-Muslim acts in the workplace, the NGO that I just mentioned covered that 11.8% of the total incidents of documented anti-Muslim racism was in the sphere of employment, primarily targeting, as it has been always the case, and as it has been covered in many different reports, Muslim women who are visible as such, primarily through by identifying them via wearing the hijab. When it comes to education, one of the most important aspects in terms of understanding institutionalized Islamophobia in Austria is certainly the idea that so-called political Islam has been framed as the main threat of the Austrian society. And this idea of a political Islam, specifically in the Austrian context, really has evolved and has been systematically introduced by the conservative leadership of the Conservative Party, the Austrian People's Party, ÖVP, Österreichische Volkspartei. And we have to understand that this Austrian People's Party has basically been in power and shaping Islam-related politics since 2015. The current government is a government led by the Austrian People's Party together with Social Democrats and Liberals. Before that, they led the government with the Greens, and before that, they led the government with the far-right FPÖ, the Freedom Party of Austria. So in total, they have been in power for the longest period of time, and it was under their governance. But again, with every other single party that is represented in the national parliament, that they have introduced one anti-Muslim legislation after the other. And part of this, and also of how to rationalize anti-Muslim policies, such as the hijab ban, such as the racialization of the school space, such as the closing of mosques, such as the problematization of other worldviews that are critical of state policies. All of this has been legitimized by claiming that this was to strike down so-called political Islam. And I think that already gives you an idea of how far-fetched this and how comprehensively adapted this concept of political Islam has been in order to really go after whatever the government feels has no place in Austrian society. So it comes from Muslim visibility in the public space, to religious attire, to even critical thought. And one of the main institutions that was established in 2020 was the Documentation Center for Political Islam. And there was, and I'm just quoting this to give you an idea even like of how politicized and how really purely informed these institutions are. That the current director, who is coming from a more conservative background, a young lady called Lisa Fellhofer, discussed the so-called Salafiyya movement after this documentation center published a report on the Salafiyya movement. And during that interview, she was referring to Prophet Muhammad living around the time of 300 after Christ. And, you know, this is just like, I mean, it might appear as something minor, but it's really, I think, something that gives you an idea that these people are, neither are they historically trained, nor do they have any kind of idea of Islamic studies or political theory or whatever. But they really are political actors. And it just reveals so much of how these institutions are being used, not to produce knowledge, but really to legitimize whatever any government led by the conservatives is doing. When it comes to media, there is a pattern that has been there for years, in which scholars and academics who are very close to the state authorities have been propagating their views in order to legitimize crackdown against Muslim institutions. And I'll give you just like one idea, one example here for a more liberal newspaper, Der Standard, in which a professor of Islamic theology, Adnan Aslan, has published an op-ed. And in that op-ed, he argues that the theological and he uses the word weltanschaulich, kind of worldview focus of Muslim associations, and he's speaking very broadly about the Islamic Authority, die Islamische Glaubensgemeinschaft in Österreich, and he says, quote unquote, it is still shaped by foreign political, theological, and Islamist interests. And according to him, he continues that most guests in mosques have quote unquote anti-Western positions, seeing the Islam of European imprint as a betrayal. And Islam of European imprint is something like the idea of the conservative movement of how Muslims should look like in order to be good assimilated Muslims. And the reason why I'm giving you like this is again one out of many examples that I give in this report on Austria of 2024, but just to give you an idea of how, in a very generalized way, there are like these pundits who are used by the government and who legitimize constantly the government's interference in Muslim affairs by framing them as basically the bad, the ugly, those who pose a threat to the national security or the society. And there is not, as it would be, fair and politically valuable, specific critique vis-a-vis specific actions and specific utterances from Muslim leaders, but rather there is a super generalized questioning of the overall status of most Muslim institutions. By attacking somebody like the Islamic religious authority, what you basically do is you question 99% of all organized Muslims in that country who are governed under these structures. Another example, and one of the things that was really a main focus in 2024 was the school. There has been a lot of discussion, and there were a lot of different pundits coming out from the conservative milieu, first and foremost, who questioned basically the existence of Muslim visibility in the school. We had also at one point in the past the general secretary who later became the chancellor of Austria and stepped down recently a year ago, who had demanded that the fasting during Ramadan should be banned for pupils under 14 years old. And there was not even like any outcry from civil society or the like, which really shows you to what extent the criminalization of basic Muslim practices, such as the 5 pillars of Islam, of which fasting is one in Ramadan, are really being problematized. And this continued very much into 2024. To give you just one example of a kind of an alternative right-wing news outlet in which a journalist, Bernhard Heinzelmeier, said, quote unquote, "The problem in Viennese schools is the Muslims. You have to say that clearly. Say that's what no one dares to say." Obviously, he is saying it, and that's why we see how people are daring to say it, right? But it's this constant problematization of the so-called cancel culture, which is never canceled because the far right has been saying all of these things for the past 20 years, and that's how they have been growing. Positioning themselves as being under siege while they are the ones who are shaping those discourses. But again, this is an example that I wanted to give you because it really laid the groundwork then for suggesting the hijab ban up until the age of 14, which was first of all negotiated between the far right, which won the elections the first time in post-World War II Austria in 2024. It was the first time the far right Freedom Party of Austria became number one, rose to the highest of its peak, and at the same time negotiated that with who else? The conservatives. But since that negotiation failed and the conservatives then realigned with the Social Democrats and the liberals, they came up with the same legislation. And we now have that actually now in 2026, awaiting being implemented in spring. The parliament has already voted for it with the majority of liberals and Social Democrats, which again is, I think, a great example of how we can see that, Islamophobic discourse is really hegemonic, and it's nothing that is purely on the far right, as some people might sometimes want to believe. I'll skip through most of this report here. Enes already mentioned this. We have covered this year and last year the first time how European nation states, their governments, political parties, but also NGOs have or have not commemorated March 15th, the International Day to Combat Islamophobia. And obviously for Austria, there was similarly no single institution that commemorated that, not even on the Muslim side. And I think that also tells you something in terms of to what extent the Muslim voices have been silenced so much that they don't even find the space to do so. On a state level, and I think that is the interesting thing really that stood out in 2024. I spoke a little bit about the Documentation Center Political Islam. That's a federal institution which is funded by the Federal Republic. Now we also have similar institutions being planned and implemented on state levels where the far right is in a coalition with the conservatives. That is the case for Styria. That is the case for Lower Austria. So basically what we see is the surveillance of Muslims, the problematization of Muslims going from the federal level to the state level. And that means a further institutionalization of the silencing and the criminalization of Muslim organizations. So they have implemented an action plan against political Islam and against radical Islam in Lower Austria. And in Upper Austria also, the FPÖ came up with an action plan against political Islam together with the conservative Austrian People's Party. To give you another example, and this is really the last one that I'll give here, we have a small section in each and every report where we also speak about the central figures in the Islamophobia network, as we call it, where we speak about people who are empowered with a lot of political or other decision-making powers. And here I'll give two examples. One of a more powerful institution and one of a more fringe institution. In Austria, there is an annual congress, which is called the European Media Summit, where decision makers and representatives of various interest groups come together to discuss global and local issues. And one of the speakers that was invited, who has a long history of anti-Muslim speaking, spreading anti-Muslim narratives, she was spreading her extreme views in that really important annual meeting. And during that time, what she did was she was criticizing Austria and Germany for their lack of a will to dissolve fundamentalist ghettos, as she referred to them. And she said one would have to implement a much more strictly regulated migration policy. And then, and I'll give this quote just to give you an example of how blatant, violent, anti-Muslim the public space has become. Because this is, again, not a fringe kind of Congress. This is like the mainstream decision makers. And she was quoted during that event saying, "Nothing will change until these people or their children get their faces kicked." And it's even more violent in the German original. In the German original, it says, "Etwas in die Fresse kriegen," which is really just like kind of almost a way of how to say it in a slurry way. But I think, again, having people like that, having reports about her saying that, having no outcry is really an indication of how violent the atmosphere has become. And I'll end now with the last example, which is more from the fringe, and that was revealed by some investigative journalists who went to an after party of a far-right identitarian movement, which is a European-wide kind of grassroots right-wing alternative social movement. And during that party, somebody who was a member of the youth group of the Alternative for Germany, who also participated there, was quoted with the following words. She said, "There were not 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust. There were at most 175,000 gassed Jews. I think it's cool that it happened. I have to be honest. The Jews were already abusing children and shit like that back then. Germany needs Srebrenica 2.0. Srebrenica happened in 1995. The genocide on Muslims. This was awesome." End quote. Now, clearly, the Alternative for Germany, as her political affiliation, said that she left the party 2 weeks prior to saying that, and that was kind of their exit strategy. But what I really want to say here, and what I want to keep us reminded of, is that the violence in thought, the violence in speech, the violence that we see implemented in those policies really speak for a very dire picture. So this is to end with, and thanks everybody for listening, and looking forward to a good conversation afterwards.
Well, Farid, thank you. Thank you very much. That was really shocking. I mean, the last part of your speech, but I think other speakers, they will also comment on this. And now I would like to give floor to Cora Alexa Døving, and she has also authored the Norwegian report, but also she is working in the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies. So the floor is yours, Cora.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me, and also thank you both for inviting me to present the state of hate in Norway, so to speak. Historically, I just want to remind everyone about that Norway has a very marginal right-wing milieu, but Norway has had 3 terrorist attacks in which Islamophobia and hate towards Muslims has played a central role. And this is an important backdrop for understanding how Islamophobia is also perceived in the Norwegian public, because we've had these terrible attacks and it has created a lot of fear in the Muslim population. But at the same time, we have also had politicians and journalists that are very aware of the dangers of having a hateful, discursive climate because of these terrorist attacks. So I would say that Islamophobia is really recognized as a societal problem in Norway. And we have also a quite good national action plan against Islamophobia, in which the term anti-Muslim racism is highlighted, which I think is important because it points to experiences of Muslims. But like the other chapters of the report, also in Norway, it has been an increase in reported hate crimes during 2024, and also attacks, no, not attacks, but threats towards mosques has also had an increase. We had 3 threats digitally, and 1 with a letter with some white powder being sent to a mosque. So, I mean, incidents are constantly happening that creates a lot of fear amongst Muslims in Norway. What I really wanted to do in my short presentation, and I will keep it a bit shorter because I'm coughing, is not to sort of go through the actual numbers because they are so easy to read in the report. But I do want to ask a question that is, I don't know if it's only relevant for Norway. I think it's relevant for a lot of the Western European countries. And that is why prejudices towards Muslims are so persistent when the Muslim population is constantly being better and better integrated in the society. Because at least in Norway, my institutions has conducted surveys on attitudes towards Muslims for many, many years. And the findings is that the prejudices are not only widespread, but they are very stable. And I keep asking myself, why is this the case in a country with so few conflicts and a well-integrated Muslim population? And I will not, and before I go on trying to give a short answer to that, I also want to just give you some examples of the most widespread ideas about Muslims in Norway. And the numbers are high, I would say. We ask questions that we pick from anti-Muslim milieus, Islamophobic milieus, and ask them to the general population. Like, you have to agree or not agree. Like, Muslims are more violent than others, 32% agrees. This is 2024 survey from 2024, yeah. Muslims are largely have themselves to blame for an increase in anti-Muslim harassment. 44% agrees to that statement. And I think that's really bad. Muslims do not fit into modern Western society. 34% agrees. Muslims pose a threat to Norwegian culture. 34% again agrees. Muslims do not want to integrate into Norwegian society. Almost 40% agrees to this statement. And the good old takeover myth, Muslims wants to take over Europe. 25% agrees to this statement. Also, we've had some specific questions referring to what's happening in the Middle East. We asked, when I think about Hamas attack on Israel, I have become more critical or more skeptical towards Muslims in general, and 34% agrees to that statement. So people sort of agree openly to generalizing onto Muslims. I also want to say that even though the numbers are high when it comes to prejudices, when we ask if you would like to have Muslims as a teacher, as a neighbor, as a friend, the numbers are much, much better. So when we measure social distance, you don't have these high numbers. But anyway, why are they so high in Norway? And I want to then, I think my I'll try to keep it short, but my answer is that we have to look to how the prejudices are connected to politics and to political causes. That's what I think you said, one of you two speakers said that about coming to the midst of political life. And in Norway, you have a really big right-wing populist party. They are not extremists at all. It's the Progress Party. They almost won the election. So it's like a big right-wing populist party. And this party has, since it was established, introduced themselves, but also circulated a specific discourse about the Muslims. And when I said that it has become part of a political cause, I think it's, I want to sort of refer to Hannah Arendt, what she said about anti-Semitism. And she said that when anti-Semitism gets to be something more than xenophobia, when it gets really big, it is because anti-Jewish feeling are acquired or gets connected to what is politically relevant. It's when you combine it with a major political issue. And in Norway, the Progress Party has used the ideas about Muslims or anti-Muslims prejudices politically to make or to develop a politics of value and a politics of identity. So it's been very explicitly used by the Progress Party as an opposition to what they call a Christian cultural heritage and a Norwegian national sort of identity. And I think that the reason why anti-Muslim sentiments and prejudices are so prevalent in a country such as Norway, which is like a quite conflict-free society in that way, is that they have managed to sort of normalize them or neutralize them as something very different from racism. It's not only critiques of Islam and not only an identity politics, but it's like attitudes that you can have and still be a very good and tolerant citizen. Because it is a kernel of truth, isn't it, when you say that Muslims are more violent than others? Okay, we don't say all Muslims, but you know, we have honor killings or we have had terrorists. They really have this kind of rhetorics that feeds into people's a mix between fear and common sense thinking. I don't know how they really do it, but they make the question of Islam and the Muslim population to a question of Norwegian nationality and also about freedom, solidarity, and freedom of speech. But I really also think that a masterpiece that the Progress Party did was that they always come with very non-committal statements. They can say something about Muslims, but they never suggest concrete political actions following what they say. Like if you say that Muslims are a threat to Norwegian culture, you should actually also have some politics that makes it difficult for Muslims to get employment or important jobs in Norway, if you really mean that they are a threat. But then you would become anti-democratic and a party that argues for discrimination laws. And the Progress Party doesn't want that. So they sort of flirt with a lot of attitudes, but they keep them very vague and dangerous in a way. So I feel that they have managed to make this, what shall I say? They use Islam as a sort of a way of talking that isn't really serious, but still it is serious because it has some consequences. And of course, they use it as a tool to attack the left and everything they hate about that part of the Norwegian society. And the masterpiece, of course, is that they also conceal the racism in the statements. I mean, all of the statements that I just read are racist in content. They are about hierarchizing Muslims, but still they are presented as something that has to do with religion or something. I don't know how they do it. But also I want to end with the ideas about the good Muslim and the bad Muslim that you all know that was coined after 9/11. And I think also that the Progress Party has sort of, they always say it's some bad, it's some Muslims are, but it's not all Muslims. So the ambiguity and the figure of the good Muslim is used to make anti-Muslim prejudices acceptable, because you can always say, oh, we can have a Muslim politician, he's good, he's clever. Or you can keep liking your local shopkeeper on the corner, Muhammad, and at the same time you can say that Muslims do not want to integrate into the Norwegian society. So it's, I think the populist, right-wing populist parties has created this room that is not recognized as extremist, but they still can feed quite extremist ideas about Muslims into the Norwegian public sphere. So I think this is really what I wanted to say. And I think the facts about ups and downs in numbers is easy to find in the report from Norway. I think the last thing I can say that is I'm really worried about some political fringes that seems to increase members. It's especially a party called Norgesdemokratene, the Democrats of Norway or something, which is talking so much. They are sort of coding Islamophobia into another language, so we shall not really recognize it, but they're talking a lot now about re-migration, about how to send back migrants. And really, when you look into how they argue, it's typically Islamophobic arguments. The very last thing is also in the shadow of the war in the Middle East is that the Progress Party also suggested that they should what you call it, when you not spy, but when you control all the mosques and what they are saying on Fridays, if you can find any hatred of Jews in their speeches. So monitoring the mosques has been also a suggestion. With sort of, with the argument that it is because we have to look out for anti-Semitism among Muslims. So I don't think the picture is, in Norway, is, to sum up, not good, but not as bad as in Austria. And you have also politicians that really want to combat the phenomenon, and hopefully will. We will continue to measure attitudes and also experiences among Muslims in my institution. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cora. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Tahir Abbas, and he will be presenting his report on Netherlands. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, colleagues, and good to see you all. And this is obviously a very important discussion we're having, and it's all very bad news so far. And I'm afraid I've got nothing more to add other than further bad news, particularly in relation to 2024 for the Netherlands, which was probably one of the worst years in my time. And just to preface my presentation, I used to live in the Netherlands for 7 years until 6 months ago. And in that time, I saw lots of different changes. But let's talk about the specifics. And the specifics are really obviously very much recorded in the report in full in terms of the statistics. But I want to be able to talk about a story that refers to the issues of politics, of issues to do with the surveillance and the policing dynamics, and also some areas of pushback, because it's not entirely all bad news. The idea of a liberal Dutch state isn't completely dead, although it has been hit very hard. So one of the big things to think about in 2024 is the Geertz Wilders Party for Freedom election, where Islamophobia was instantly upgraded from opposition noise to governing grammar. The opening pages of the promise was to introduce the strictest asylum regime ever, a thin euphemism for cutting off the primary legal route, essentially, for Muslim newcomers. And of course, Wilders did not become prime minister because no party wanted to be with him. And this is Geert Wilders has been the face of Islamophobia in the Netherlands ever since he emerged in politics, essentially 20 years ago. No other party wanted to form a government with him. But his 37-page manifesto was effectively copy-pasted into coalition policy, weaponizing the whole of government against the Muslim presence. Secular parties capitulated, trading hijab bans for climate concessions, proving that anti-Muslim bargaining chips are now negotiable currency in Dutch coalition mathematics. The first press conference flew a single flag, Israeli blue-white, no Palestinian colors allowed, signaling whose trauma counts and who is dismissed. One of the big things from 2024, and it's something that's impacted on the UK this year as well, is the 6th to the 7th November Maccabi Tel Aviv football fans incident, where they marched through Amsterdam waving flags, Israeli flags, chanting death to Arabs and tearing down Palestinian banners. We've seen plenty of videos on social media of fans beating up an Arab taxi driver unconscious, and mainstream outlets buried the clip, opting for a simpler headline: Jews hunted in Amsterdam. Mayor Femke Halsema coined the phrase anti-Semitic hit-and-run squads, a soundbite that was repeated 400 times on national radio before any court testimony was heard. The Prime Minister, the King of the Netherlands, all came out in statements to say that this is a Jewish program. We don't want to go back to this time in the Second World War, and this is a major horror show that should never have happened. Within 24 hours, Wilders tweeted a map of Amsterdam tinted green labeled Gaza of Europe, turning a football clash into existential civilization war. And then as politics emerged, the parliament adopted a motion to close Salafist mosques as retaliation. Although 0 rioters were mosque affiliated and 1 arrested hooligan wore a Hamas equals ISIS t-shirt. The corrections by the BBC and the New York Times came way too late. Dutch broadcasters never retracted, cementing a false program narrative as 2024's most exported Islamophobic myth. And on the media, national outlets quoted Wilders 6-1 versus any Muslim voices, laundering party propaganda into neutral seeming copy. We've got AI-generated images of bearded men burning Torah scrolls, trending on Dutch X, and fact checks reached 4% of the retweets that the fakes achieved. We have RTL's late-night panel program using a 2014 Syrian photo to illustrate Amsterdam jihad, later blaming a production intern for while refusing an on-air apology. Muslim journalists who pitched counter stories were told their identity might cloud objectivity. An editorial veto never applied to white majority reporters. Dutch anti-discrimination hotline LMD reported a 276% spike in anti-Muslim slurs within 10 days of the riot coverage cycle. Also, Amsterdam police deployed 2,500 extra officers, none tasked with protecting visibly Muslim women who reported hijab holes and spitting. The National Coordinator for Counterterrorism widened Islamist threat level to include passive support for Hamas, criminalizing quiet prayer vigils for Gaza. At least 150 terror glorification cases were opened. 80 concerned social media posts with Palestinian flags or from the river to the sea lyrics. Police visited 43 schools to question teenagers who skipped class for a pro-Palestine strike, recording names in the preventive juvenile file without parental consent. One 14-year-old was interrogated for liking a TikTok clip of a Gaza funeral, held for 3 hours without a lawyer. The case was later dropped. Trauma untreated. Now, coalition agreement pledges a hijab ban for all public-facing civil servants, extending existing school bans into adulthood and unemployment offices. A fast-track bill criminalizes support for a terrorist organization with up to 6 years jail. The explanatory memo explicitly names Hamas, equating with Muslim advocacy. The City of Hague introduced bylaws allowing mosques to be closed for disturbing public order if neighbors complain about amplified call to prayer, even at legal decibel levels. Courts upheld an employer's right to reject applicants named Mohammed because the recruiter robot flagged the name as potential integration risk. Legal aid NGOs report a 58% jump in workforce discrimination appeals, yet only 7% reach court due to new filing fields tripled for identity-based claims. Randstad, the largest temp agency, instructs branches to prefer cultural fit when staffing client-facing roles. Internal slides list hijab as visible non-fit. Muslim women who began wearing hijab mid-career faced demotion or desk isolation. One rubber bank analyst was moved to the back office after a customer complained about reassurance. Government diversity covenants exclude religious attire from inclusion metrics, rendering hijab discrimination invisible in annual diversity reports. And during this time also, self-employment among Dutch Muslims rose 28% in 5 years. Not because of necessary entrepreneurial zeal, but because payroll doors keep swinging shut. We also have this sort of neutrality code being introduced by Dutch school boards, copying the sort of Flanders-style neutrality, so-called. 8 Rotterdam schools banned not only hijab, but also Palestine wristbands. Islamic holiday leave requests were denied for Eid al-Fitr because too many teachers already asked for Easter holiday, a parity argument courts accept. University of Amsterdam cancelled the conference on Islamophobia after the Minister of Education warned universities to avoid platforming political Islam, a theme that we hear across Europe. Muslim Students Association must now submit guest speaker lists to security officers 14 days in advance, a requirement not imposed on any other fraternities. And Muslim people were sent home for fasting without parental note, while Christian classmates continued Lent, fast and challenged. Lecturers report colleagues joking, "Don't say Hamas or they'll report you," creating a chilling silence around Gaza in classrooms. We also have some terrible gendered and intersectional impact. One woman was pushed off a bike while being told, "Go find a husband to control you." Police filed it as a simple assault, omitting the slur. Gynecology clinics in Utrecht and Nijmegen introduced neutral clothing policies interpreted as banning hijab for nurses, despite no patient complaints. Feminist organizations that marched against headscarves in 2003 remained silent on 2024 hijab dismissals, revealing selective solidarity. Muslim women report avoiding evening classes or hospital night shifts, citing increased street harassment since the program narrative took hold. But there is resistance. Pop-up hijab cafes, public qawwali, flash mobs, and Instagram reels reclaiming orange tulips as symbols of dual Muslim Dutch identity. There's also civil society pushback. Collective Against Islamophobia opened 612 cases, triple the 2022 load, but funding collapsed when the lottery board deemed the topic too political. Nevertheless, a grassroots hijab solidarity chain saw 3,000 non-Muslim women wear headscarves for a day, flooding TikTok with the Scarf for Respect campaign. Churches in The Hague offered sanctuary to threatened Muslim activists, reviving an old asylum tradition last used for Yugoslav refugees. Kickstarter campaigns raised 180,000 euros for legal fees to challenge mosque closure motions, dwarfing previous crowdfunded records. Moroccan Dutch lawyers formed a pro bono pool. Within 6 months, they secured 6 out-of-court settlements for hijab workplace dismissals. Yet mainstream NGOs still hesitate to label anti-hijab policies as Islamophobia, preferring the softer title, religious discrimination, which slows down coalition building. Nevertheless, we still have some international echoes to consider. Dutch diplomats lobbied EU states to dilute the UN Islamophobia resolution, arguing religion-blind language better protects secularism. The foreign minister cancelled a planned visit to Indonesia's largest mosque after Israeli pressure, signaling that Muslim diplomatic outreach is expendable. Dutch tech firms exported AI crowd scan software to France and Italy, boasting Amsterdam tested algorithms that tag kaffirs as risk objects. Wilders spoke at CPAC in Washington, sharing the Amsterdam pogrom slide deck. US far-right influencers now cite the Netherlands as the template. So many risks as we look forward. There are obviously some possibilities of a different direction with a new government that's about to be formed, having been through an election a couple of months ago. It's tilted back to the center, but it's still very center-right. I mean, coalition agreements often take many, many months and collapse soon after. But there are issues concerning around the proposed Nationality Neutrality Act, which could extend headscarf bans to private contractors delivering public services, such as hospital cleaners, bus drivers, school caterers. Intelligence services seek expanded chat monitoring powers. Leaked memos list frequent Quran quotes as potential radical indicators. Coalition parties agreed to explore stripping a dual citizen terror sympathizers of nationality. This stripping of nationality is becoming more of a problem everywhere. And this is obviously overwhelmingly targeted at Dutch Moroccan youth. And there are obviously things that still need to be done. Independent Islamophobia monitoring is still necessary, and it's not in the powers of the state to investigate, subpoena, or public name discriminators. This needs urgent action. We need to think about the Constitution to extend hate speech protections to religion, closing the Article 150 loophole that leaves Muslim hatred unprotected and unprosecuted. And then there's the idea of the need to publish stop and search data broken down by perceived religion, as it's already done for race. And Muslim-led mental health services, a chronic lack of services for a group that is on the brink of quite a lot of trauma, just through everyday acts of humiliation and exclusion, which are unchecked and unbound. So the regional, the Netherlands chapter is not a regional footnote. It's a canary in the European coal mine. When it's supposed to be a liberal flagship nation, it normalizes mosque closures, hijab bans, and AI-driven surveillance of Muslim bodies. The contagion spreads. There's the so-called Amsterdam program that became the alibi for illegal and cultural crackdown wider than any post 9/11 measure. Women are sacked for scarves, teenagers are interrogated for tweets, fathers are afraid to speak Arabic in parks. This is really testing the so-called Dutch integration model. And the idea that citizenship is negotiable for the country's 1 million Muslims is also deeply concerning. So, as colleagues have identified elsewhere, we have quite an alarming set of concerns going on across Europe, but also in the case of the Netherlands, which has retreated from its broad liberal progressive principles that have seen it seen as a bit of a beacon, perhaps historically in the UK, in the European context. And a lot of this is also about politics. It's about populism. It's about authoritarianism. It's a kind of make Dutch great again. And we've seen this in terms of targeting universities, the closure of English language programs, the silencing of protests by students, by even scholars in relation to the ongoing events in Gaza, that tell you of a very bleak picture in the Dutch framework presently. And while there is some resistance, it's very small in comparison. So sorry to provide much more negative news, but I'm afraid this is a rather consistent picture we're dealing with. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have a really positive example. I mean, even if in the past we had Portugal, which was more positive if you compare it with the other countries, but in recent years there has been also some increasing of Islamophobia in Portugal, even in Portugal. So this is a general trend, so that we can observe in all around Europe. So now I would like to give the floor to Amina. Amina, she will be talking and present his report on Belgium. The floor is yours, Amina.
Thank you so much, Professor Bayraklı. First of all, congratulations on the 10th edition of the Islamophobia report. I will try to keep it short because I know we're running out of time, and also a lot of important topics have been discussed, so I don't want to repeat myself. But You can find the data in the report, but there are some major points that I would like to touch upon, especially because I've been writing the report on Belgium for the past 3 years, and also wrote the report on the Netherlands before that for 2 years. So there's this general tendency that I have noticed and that I would like to share with you, actually. So first of all, when it comes to Belgium, what I've noticed is, because everybody is talking about very specific attacks and violence towards Muslims, etc. And for example, the event about Maccabi, etc. in the Netherlands, and then other attacks on Muslims, someone being pulled off a bike. Actually, the most intriguing part about the report in Belgium is that we don't actually have that kind of events almost, which is actually interesting because there's nothing being mentioned whatsoever in the media. Everything I find on specific attacks on Muslims, or for example, cases of discrimination based on hijab, or for example, being fired because of a headscarf, or for example, racial slurs, etc. I don't find that data anywhere whatsoever in the media, not mainstream, not out of the mainstream. I just find it. Where do I find it? In reports done by other human rights institutions, Belgian institutions, that come up with this information like, hey guys, you know that this happened. I mean, this is actually very significant because it is not even deemed worthy to be mentioned in mainstream media, or it is, as was mentioned before by several colleagues, actually just downplayed, and like, it's not that big of a deal, you know, if you make some kind of remark towards a Muslim. Okay, I mean, like, it's not encouraged, but it's not punished either. So this is something that really disturbs me personally, because I feel like we need, of course, I always say we need more data, but here we clearly see that it is not being reflected in mainstream media, which shows that Muslims really aren't that much of a part of mainstream media either, which again downplays their importance and their roles in the Belgian society, even though they are almost 10% of Belgian society. What makes this even more intriguing is that the end of 2024, in December, actually some different police departments in different cities made an active call towards Muslims to start reporting hate speech more. So this is the irony. So on the one hand, it's not being mentioned in media whatsoever, but even the police like, hey guys, please, come mention it. Come tell us, and we will declare it, and we will make a file, etc. And they actually had to do a social media campaign, just making people aware, like, hey, this is not okay for you to deal with Islamophobia, I mean, with hate speech. And this also brings me to the point, like, both Muslims and non-Muslims are not even aware what exactly Islamophobia is, what it means, what the impact is of Islamophobia on people. Like, for example, like Cora indicated, okay, in a way, people have these ideas like, okay, they acknowledge certain ideas, like, for example, Muslims are more violent, etc. And they just think it's okay, and you can still deal with the people in the neighborhood, in Muhammad in the shop at the corner, but you can. But in general, Muslims are problematic, and they deserve to be warned every now and then. And it's like a naughty child that needs to be warned the whole time. Like, okay, you're kind of accepting them, but you're also aware that they're doing something wrong. And then you feel like you have to keep punishing them, and like, okay, this is not correct behavior, and you're constantly tracking them, but you're also not really acknowledging that person at the same time. And this is something that we see systematically in Islamophobia. And so my point is here is, like, if we really want to go further in this research in Islamophobia and take it to a higher point, is that we really understand the specific implications of Islamophobia. I'm not just talking about, of course, someone being on the receiving end of a blow to the face, for example. I'm talking about how systematically it affects people's psychology to always deal with these prejudices that people seem to consistently believe that Muslims are more violent, that Muslims are somehow part of the problem. For example, that Muslims, especially after the October attacks by Hamas, that this general idea like Muslims are the instigator, Muslims are the issues, Muslims refuse to integrate. And it doesn't matter if they are second or third, I forgot the word. Generation, but it doesn't matter. They just receive this treatment as if they just arrived to Belgium the day before. So all of them systematically are being treated like, okay, you need to be integrated. It doesn't matter if they were born there. It doesn't matter if their parents were born there. Like, you need to be worked on. You're not done yet. We still have a lot of work to do with you. And I just see how systematically it just is being ignored, how that impacts a person. Just imagine you constantly, every step you take as a Belgian citizen, every word you say, every mistake you make is being scrutinized, being observed, and people are just basically waiting for you to screw up so that they can point you out again and call out on that, so that they can say Muslims are doing this and this again. So this psychological huge responsibility that is constantly put on the shoulders of Muslims is also being overviewed. And I think for people to really understand Islamophobia, especially for Belgium, because like I said, we don't really have these physical attacks. We're more of a passive aggressive kind of country. So that's why it's more like under the surface. So we really, for real true inclusion to be able to be done with and to exist in Belgium, I think it's important for both sides to really understand what is right and what is wrong, what is correct behavior, what kind of statements, like Cora indicated. I mean, like, technically, when you look at those statements, like Muslims are violent or more violent, just making that statement anywhere in the middle of, for example, go to any square and make that statement, people will be like, oh, that's really racist. Why are you saying that? But then people are secretly still believing that. And that is the big issue. So people really need to be aware of, like, what is okay and what is not, and really accept that most of the Muslims that actually live in Belgium, that they are actual citizens of Belgium, and that they have as much rights to be and exist as without any scrutiny as much as other Belgians have. And this is something that is not being accepted, and that is something that is systematically being ignored. And actually, there's a study from done by a PhD student in Leuven, and she stated Islamophobia is a systemic and deeply embedded social problem in Belgium, not merely a series of isolated prejudices. So it really goes a lot deeper. And that's the end of her research, her PhD research. She came to that. It's like Muslims, it doesn't matter if they are Dutch, Belgian by origin, or if they have parents who are migrants but were born in Belgium, they are systematically being otherized, no matter how well they know the language, no matter how well they are integrated. There's always a reason to describe them as not being integrated. And for women, this goes doubly, because they already have, like, the gender gap, and then still a gender gap, pay gap is still a thing in Belgium, especially with the hijab. You are really basically, it's pure luck if you do end up with a job, especially if it's more on a higher level. And second point I would like to touch upon, and I will keep it short, is that we really notice that the discourse is shifting to immigration. So most of the parties, they're not talking explicitly about Islam, but now what are they saying? There's like, we should stop migration, we should stop the influx of migrants, etc. But basically what they mean is we should stop more Muslims from coming in. That's basically what they are saying without explicitly stating that. Because this idea is like, already Islam is not compatible with Europe. Okay, we already have enough Muslims as it is. We're trying to get them integrated, but they won't cooperate. So we need to make sure that not more of those come in. And now the biggest issue is that, like I said, a migrant that just arrived the day before is being treated the same as someone who is a Muslim and has been there for 2 or 3 generations. So this is also something that we are really seeing in the current political discourse at the moment. It is always, the focus is on immigrants. So many protests against the opening of new asylums, etc., for refugees, etc. The focus is on the refugees, but actually it's just another way of saying, it's like, we don't want Muslim or Islam here in Europe. And people are not able to see difference between Muslims who have a Belgian identity and also identify as Belgian, and Muslims who just arrived within Belgium. So again, they have to deal with these kind of prejudices of people believing that those migrants, they don't know the language, they don't know the culture, they don't know how to be properly Belgian, so they have to battle those prejudices even more, because these newly triggered dislike towards immigrants. This is the second point I would like to touch upon. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Amina. And it has been a very long panel. But before closing, and I would like to thank you all for your contribution, and the report will be available on our webpage around in a half an hour from Islamophobia.com. You can download the whole report, and we will share it also in our Twitter account. But before closing the panel, I would like to reiterate our main findings or policy recommendations that we have summarized in our introduction. And firstly, we believe that anti-Muslim racism must be officially recognized. This is the most important policy recommendation that we have been actually mentioning from the start, from the first report, and incorporated into national action plans against racism. Without formal acknowledgement, policy responses will remain fragmented and insufficient. Secondly, counterterrorism frameworks that disproportionately target Muslims must be reviewed, revised, and aligned with human rights principles. Third, key civil liberties, including freedom of speech, assembly, and religious expression, must be urgently defended from further erosion. Fourth, states should fully implement ECRI's General Policy Recommendation number 5 on combating anti-Muslim racism. Finally, civil society coalitions should be strengthened through funding, capacity building, and structured cooperation. Protecting democratic values requires coordinated action, transparent policy making, and sustained investment in inclusion. Governments must improve data collection on hate crimes, Islamophobia, and ensure accountability for institutional discrimination, racism, and support educational programs that challenge misinformation. Strengthened cooperation between Muslim communities, civil society actors, and public institutions is essential to resisting the normalization of Islamophobia. And only through sustained and collective commitment can Europe address these structural roots of anti-Muslim racism and safeguard the rights, dignity, and security of all its residents. I would like to thank you all for your contribution once again, and we will be continuing this project together with Farid and with your contributions in the next year also, because we think it's a very important project. And in the last year, we all together we have created a literature around Islamophobia in Europe, and also researchers can use this going back. They have a data now on 10 years in different countries, so they can look into this and compare different fields, employment, education, you name it. And I think it's very essential that we continue. And also, we urge other scholars to create and publish annual reports on different countries or continents. We do not have enough time or sufficient funding to do this ourselves, but there are other areas that, especially for instance in India, there is a really a big problem with Islamophobia that we are seeing in the last decade or so. Before, of course, closing, I would like to give the floor once again to Farid. Maybe he will share with us his last words.
Thank you as well. Thank you, Enes, for doing the moderation. And I saw on X, I think we had around 900 folks who were on the screen and were watching this presentation. So thank you a lot for the interest. And I think that also speaks to how important really this topic is. I think there are not 900 Islamophobia scholars on this planet, right? So it's good to see that people maybe from allied forces, not only the enemies, are here watching and looking at what we're doing. So similar to what you said, Enes, I mean, we had hundreds of authors in the meantime through over the past 10 years who have been contributing. So in that sense, a big thank you to each and everyone who had been participating in that process. I think we have done and have provided a good groundwork for a lot of scholarship, and we can see that also in the citations of our report throughout the globe in different publications. Many of you have been working on Islamophobia in the more academic sphere, but also in the policy making sphere. We have seen the impact that and the difference that the report made when we see that some state authorities in Europe and beyond have been drawing on the report in order to do something good to improve their societies, to make a contribution to a fairer, more just society. And let's see where we're gonna go from there. And thank you everybody for being part of this. I appreciate it.
Once again, thank you. Thank you, Farid. Thank you, Amina. Thank you, Ahmed, Shaheed, and Cora, and Tahir, Abbas for your contributions. And looking forward to see you next year in the next year's report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everybody.